So I need to start with the moment itself, because everything in this story radiates outward from one specific Thursday afternoon, and if I don't describe it precisely, you won't fully understand why what happened afterward felt the way it did. I was sitting in what we called the strategy room, which was just a slightly nicer conference room on the 4th floor, with better chairs and a view of the parking garage. There were 8 people around the table: our division head, 2 regional leads, someone from finance I didn't recognize, and our CEO, who visited our office maybe 3 or 4 times a year, and whose presence in any room immediately changed the energy of everyone in it. And there was my manager. I'll call him Nathan. Nathan was sitting at the near end of the table, directly to the left of where I was sitting, which mattered more than I realized at the time. The meeting was about a restructuring of our client onboarding process, something the company had been discussing in various forms for close to a year, without much concrete progress. I'd spent most of the previous 6 weeks building a specific framework for how to fix it, a phased approach with clear ownership at each stage and measurable handoff criteria between teams. I'd put it together mostly on evenings and weekends because honestly, I found the problem genuinely interesting, and I'd wanted to impress people, which is a very human and very exploitable instinct as it turns out. 3 days before this meeting, I'd sent Nathan the full document, 31 pages, detailed, with a visual process map I'd built from scratch. He'd responded with one sentence: "Good stuff. I'll look it over before Thursday." I thought that meant he was going to mention it in the meeting, possibly share the document, maybe say something like, "One of my team members has been working on this." What actually happened was different. Nathan opened his laptop, pulled up what I recognized immediately as a condensed version of my own document, and spent 11 minutes presenting my framework to the CEO as if it had come entirely from his own head. He used my exact phasing language. He described my handoff criteria structure almost word for word. He even used an analogy I'd written, the one comparing our current onboarding to a relay race, where nobody was sure who was supposed to be holding the baton. The CEO liked it, a lot, said it was exactly the kind of structured thinking the initiative had been missing. Asked Nathan several follow-up questions, which Nathan answered, some correctly, some in ways that made it clear he hadn't actually read the document as carefully as he'd needed to understand it at depth. I sat there for the entire 11 minutes without saying anything. I want to be honest about that. I didn't interrupt, didn't correct him in the room, didn't make a scene, partly because I was genuinely shocked, and partly because somewhere, in a quiet corner of my brain, I was already thinking about what I was going to do instead. Here's what you need to understand about Nathan before I go any further, because I think it matters for the story. He was not a bad manager in the obvious dramatic ways. He didn't scream, didn't publicly humiliate people, didn't play obvious favorites in ways that everyone could see and agree on. The kind of bad he was operated quietly, which honestly made it harder to name and harder to prove. He was the kind of manager who never attributed ideas to the people who had them, not in a theatrical, deliberate theft kind of way, more in a passive, consistent pattern of simply never saying a name when presenting upward. The team came up with this when it was one specific person. We've been developing a framework when it was someone's 60 hours of unpaid evening work. The credit just evaporated somewhere between the person who generated it and the person above Nathan who received it. I'd noticed this pattern before in smaller ways. A suggestion I'd made in a team meeting that reappeared in a leadership update without my name attached. A solution I'd walked Nathan through that showed up in his next one-on-one with the division head as if he'd arrived at it independently. Small things, the kind of things you notice and then talk yourself out of caring about because you don't want to be the person who's petty about these things. By Thursday afternoon in that conference room, I had talked myself out of it too many times. I went home that evening and sat with it for a while before deciding what to do. Actually thought about doing nothing, just let it go, which is what most people in my position probably do most of the time. But something kept circling back. It wasn't really even about credit in the abstract. It was about the CEO specifically, because the CEO having that conversation with Nathan, attributing that framework to Nathan, filing away in his head that Nathan was the kind of structured thinker who produced that kind of work. That was a concrete, lasting reputational effect that would compound over time. Nathan would get opportunities and visibility that were built, partially, on work that wasn't his. And I found I wasn't able to just accept that and move on. So I started thinking about what I actually had. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had quite a lot. The original 31-page document existed in my personal cloud storage, dated and time-stamped from the weeks before the meeting. Every draft of it actually, going back 6 weeks, each one dated. The email I'd sent Nathan 3 days before the meeting, with the full document attached, was sitting in my sent folder. His one-sentence response was there too. The process map I'd built, which had specific visual choices and labeling conventions that were distinctive enough to be identifiable as the same document if placed side by side with whatever Nathan had used in that meeting. And there was one more thing, something I hadn't even thought about until I was sitting there going through what I had. Our company used a collaborative document platform where everything had edit histories, and the condensed version Nathan had presented from had been created in that platform, which meant there was an edit history showing exactly when it had been created, who had created it, and what documents had been used as source material. I opened the platform and found the file Nathan had used. Checked the edit history. It had been created 2 days before the meeting. The source document it linked to was mine. I actually laughed when I saw that. Not in a funny way, more in the way you laugh when something you hoped wasn't true turns out to be completely, documentably, verifiably true. Now here's where I want to be honest about the choice I was making, because I think it's the most important part of this whole story. I didn't go to HR, not initially. I didn't forward the email to Nathan's manager with a furious note attached. I didn't do anything reactive at all, because reactive, in my experience, almost always plays worse than deliberate, even when you're completely in the right. What I did instead was write an email to the CEO, not about Nathan, not about the meeting, not accusatory, not confrontational. I wrote to the CEO directly, referencing the meeting from Thursday, and said that I was glad the framework had landed well, and that I'd been developing it for about 6 weeks, and would love the opportunity to walk him through the fuller version of the document if he had any interest, since what Nathan had been able to cover in the meeting was necessarily a condensed version of something considerably more detailed. I attached the full 31-page document. I did not mention that Nathan had presented it without crediting me. I didn't need to. The email, as written, made the authorship perfectly clear in a way that was completely professional and completely unassailable. I read it back about 6 times before sending it, changed 2 words, then sent it. Then I waited. The CEO replied the following morning. I want to walk you through what his email said because the specific language matters. He said he'd found Thursday's presentation interesting and that he was glad to hear I'd been behind the framework. He said the document I'd attached was impressively detailed and that he'd like to find time to go through it properly. He asked if I was available for a call the following week. And then, in the final paragraph, he mentioned that he'd copied Nathan on the email to make sure he's looped in. Read that again? He copied Nathan, which meant Nathan received an email from the CEO praising my work, addressed to me, with the clear implication that the CEO now understood exactly who had actually built the framework that Nathan had spent 11 minutes presenting as his own creation. I did not write anything in that email that made Nathan look bad. I did not need to. The CEO had just done it for me, completely unintentionally, simply by replying to what I'd sent. I had a conversation with Nathan the next day. He came to my desk, which was unusual. Nathan was not the kind of person who generally came to other people's desks. He sat down, didn't quite make full eye contact, and said something along the lines of wanting to check in about where I was at on various things. I kept the conversation entirely normal, didn't acknowledge the email, didn't reference the meeting, just talked about current work. But Nathan knew. I could tell he knew from the specific quality of his attempt to seem casual. It's a very particular kind of overcorrection, the slightly too friendly energy of someone who has recently understood that something they thought they got away with has in fact come apart very cleanly around them. Over the following weeks, a few things happened. The CEO's call happened first. I walked him through the full framework in detail. He asked good questions, the kind you can only ask if you've actually read something carefully, which told me he had. At the end of the call, he mentioned that he thought there was an opportunity to present a version of this at the quarterly leadership meeting and asked if I would be comfortable doing that. I said yes, obviously. The leadership meeting presentation happened about 3 weeks later. I presented directly to a room that included Nathan, our division head, 2 other regional leads, and the CEO. It was the same framework, my name on every slide. Nathan sat in the 3rd row and said nothing for the entire 45 minutes. Here is what changed in the months that followed. The framework was formally adopted as the company's new onboarding process, with a documented attribution to my name in the internal rollout announcement. That attribution was, I found out later, specifically requested by the CEO's office. I was promoted about 4 months after the quarterly meeting, a level above where I had been, with a salary adjustment that reflected the new role. Nathan was not promoted in the same cycle. He had been up for consideration, apparently, before the CEO's involvement in all of this. He remains at the same level he was at when this story began, as far as I know, still managing a team, still not entirely sure, I imagine, exactly how things unfolded the way they did. I'll be honest about something. I sometimes think about the version of this story where I confronted Nathan directly after the meeting, went to his office, said what I knew, demanded acknowledgement. And I think in that version of events, Nathan probably apologizes, possibly insincerely, possibly genuinely, and the moment gets processed as a conflict between 2 people of unequal power in a hierarchy that inherently favors him. Instead, the version that actually happened gave the CEO the information he needed to form his own conclusion, completely independently, without any accusation attached. It let the documented evidence do the work, rather than my anger. And it positioned me not as someone with a grievance, but as someone who had simply built something impressive and wanted the right person to know about it. Here's what I think about when I look back on this. Nathan stole my idea in a room full of people because he assumed I would do what most people do, absorb the frustration, tell a few friends, and eventually just let it calcify into a workplace resentment that goes nowhere. What he didn't account for was that I had every single piece of documentation I needed to tell the story accurately to the one person who mattered most, without ever having to make a single accusation. The best revenge in a professional environment almost never looks like revenge. It looks like someone quietly making sure that the right people have the right information. That's it. That's the whole strategy. Truth, in my experience, doesn't need to be dramatic to be effective. It just needs to reach the right person before the wrong version of it gets too comfortable. That's Karma Filed. Real ideas, real documentation, real justice that nobody had to force. If this one resonated, you know what to do. Subscribe, hit the bell, the next story is waiting. I'll see you Tuesday.